Chapter 1. The vanished horseshoe mist cold above the manicured lawns of Marlford Hall at dawn, lending the grand estate an ethereal, almost spectral quality, the great stone for Wade, ivy-clad and venerable, seemed to hold its breath as servants, hurried about, preparing for the day's festivities. It was the morning of the much-anticipated Marlford Equine Gala, an event that attracted the most illustrious horse breeders and enthusiasts from across England. Among the curiosities on display that year was a singular exhibit, the gilded horseshoe of Nightingale's pride, the legendary steed whose unbeaten racing record had become the stuff of local legend. At precisely 5 o'clock, when the dew still beaded upon the hedgerows, Hercule Poirot was roused in his suite by a discreet knock from his valet, George. Adjusting the folds of his silk dressing-gown, Poirot allowed himself a moment to survey the morning through his window, an uninterrupted vista of rolling paddocks, whose tranquillity belied the storm to come. He sipped his tea with the deliberate grace of a man fully confident in the power of his little grey cells, content in the knowledge that they would soon be in lively exercise below stairs. The household buzzed with anxious anticipation. Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, oversaw the arrangement of ordeal for the gala breakfast, her stern features furrowed with worry and unusual tremor for her usually unflappable composure. Young Mary, the under-butler, whispered nervous updates to his colleagues. A priceless artifact had been entrusted to their care, and today it was to be unveiled before a host of distinguished guests. The horseshoe, forged from the finest steel and embellished with gold leaf, symbolized both sporting triumph and the Winthrop family's 5-generation heritage at Marlford Hall. By 7 o'clock. Guests arrived in carriages and motor cars, their silhouettes drifting through the mist like spectres of high society. Lady Winthrop herself, tall and imposing, descended from her barouche with an air of regal affability. Her pale blue gown contrasted sharply with her dark widow's veil, a sartorial choice that had sparked scandal only days before, for she had recently refused the suit of a passing suitor under mysterious circumstances. Colonel Archibald Montague, retired from His Majesty's army, offered her a bow as precise as any drill formation. His hawk-like gaze swept the grounds, betraying a habitual vigilance. Miss Eloise Blythe, a celebrated novelist of rising fame, alighted beside them, her eyes gleaming with curiosity and a hint of mischief. The procession made its way to the gala pavilion, a white canvas structure adorned with garlands of roses and laurel. Poirot descended at his own leisurely pace, observing each detail with the intensity of a man accustomed to seeing the invisible. He noted how Lady Winthrop's gloved hand trembled ever so slightly as she greeted her guests, and how Colonel Montag's rigid posture gave way for just the briefest moment when Miss Blythe approached. All in all, a perfect tableau for the commencement of a grand society affair, yet within Poirot's keen mind the seeds of doubt were already taking root. Chapter 2. The first clue as a hush fell over the pavilion as the last of the ribbons was tied and the final garland of roses affixed. Poirot lingered at the edge of the gathering crowd, his sharp eyes surveying the scene with the precision of a jeweler examining a flawless gem, the gilded horseshoe. Once the centerpiece of eager conversation, was now nothing more than an empty, velvet-lined case. Its absence rippled through the onlookers like a sudden chill. Lady Winthrop's composure, so carefully maintained during her arrival, seemed to momentarily falter. Her gloved fingers clenched the edge of the display table, and for an instant her face paled. Colonel Montague, quick to notice any breach of decorum, stepped forward with measured concern. "My lady," he began, his voice slow, "is something amiss?" Mrs. Aldridge emerged from behind the rows of guests, her posture rigid. "It appears," she said in a clipped tone, "that the horseshoe is missing. The simple statement carried weight like a cathedral bell. A gasp rose and fell among the assembled, and camera shutters clicked as some amateur photographers seized the moment. Poirot advanced with deliberate grace, coming to stand beside Mrs. Aldrich. He raised a single eyebrow. Mon Dieu, but where? Would one hide such a thing in so public a setting? His tone was more amused speculation than alarm, yet his eyes were alive with interest. A soft gasp from the crowd drew Poirot's attention to Miss Blythe, who knelt by the empty display case. She peered at the velvet cushion, now marred by two faint depressions where the horseshoe's arched shape had pressed. Leaning closer, she traced a slender finger along the edge of the fabric. "Look here," she said. Voice hushed. These indentations are fresh. Someone lifted the horseshoe with care. Poirot stooped, inspecting the shallow grooves. "'Twas been observed," he murmured. Monsieur Hastings would have made the same deduction, though perhaps less elegantly. He ran his gloved fingertip along a tiny fray in the velvet, noting a single thread protruding, and see the fabric is torn at this exact spot. The removal was neither crude nor hurried. Our culprit handled the prize with caution. A ripple of excitement ran through the onlookers, but Poirot raised a hand, tempering their enthusiasm. "Patience, Msamus. The game is afoot, but we must observe methodically before leaping to conclusions." He stood straight, glancing across the pavilion. To his right, Lady Winthrop's face was an impassive mask, but her eyes darted toward Colonel Montague, to his left. The colonel himself looked unconvinced, his jaw set with impatience, and beyond them, several lesser figures, an anxious jockey, a nervous bookmaker, and a delicate young lady in lavender exchanged furtive glances. Poirot circled the display table, his gaze sweeping from the frayed velvet to the surrounding floor. There, almost hidden by a trailing hem of Lady Winthrop's gown, lay a single horseshoe nail. It gleamed dully in the haze of morning light. Poirot bent to retrieve it, examining its top, which bore a tiny smudge of red and a faint fingerprint. "Each he said, turning the nail between his fingers. "I do not believe this is part of the original tack." He held it out for Mrs. Aldrich to see. "Madam, was any nail used in securing the cushion or its frame?" The housekeeper hesitated. "No, Monsieur Poirot. The case was screwed shut beneath, not nailed. This must belong to the actual horseshoe, indeed." Poirot slipped the nail into a small evidence bag that George produced. "It seems our thief left a souvenir." He looked up, fixing each face in turn with his dark, probing eyes. But let us not be distracted by dramatic flourishes. The theft occurred in plain view, beneath the noses of all present, and yet only one pair of hands could have accomplished it without detection. A murmur passed among the guests as Poirot's gaze settled on Colonel Montague. The colonel stiffened. "Surely you cannot suspect me, monsieur?" he asked coolly. "I suspect only that the thief is present," Poirot replied softly. "I suspect that person handled the horseshoe with respectful care, likely someone accustomed to handling valuable objects." He turned to Lady Winthrop. "And, madame, someone close to you who knew the horseshoe's precise value and significance." Lady Winthrop's lips pressed together. "You imply I am complicit in my own disgrace," she said, her voice steady despite the flush creeping to her cheeks. A murmur of nervous laughter rippled through a few guests, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. Poirot raised a gloved hand. "Not at all, madam. Only that our culprit is well acquainted with the prize. The question remains, which of U.S.?" He gestured to the neighboring stalls, where a display of ribbons and trophies went largely unnoticed in the confounding of theories. Poirot moved on, his slender form weaving through the crowd toward the perimeter of the pavilion. There, the damp grass bore a series of footprints, each one distinctive, one set, belonging to Mary the under-butler, was small and neat. Another, larger and heavier, matched the polished boots of Colonel Montague. A third, smaller again but deeper, corresponded to the high-heeled slippers of Miss Blythe. And finally, a faint, irregular impression set apart from the rest a shoe with a slightly split sole that had pressed unevenly into the turf. Poirot knelt and studied the lone print. He pressed his fingertip into the soft earth, feeling the distinct shape of a cracked heel. Remarkable, he murmured. Someone hastened away, not wanting to be seen. But look how the sole has worn through at the right side only a few pairs of shoes would exhibit. Such a fault. He rose, brushing sole from his fingers. I believe we shall find that person among us. He turned, walking back toward the stunned assembly. His eyes, bright with anticipation, settled on four figures: Lady Winthrop, Colonel Montague, Miss Blythe, and the jockey, Mr. Frederick Dunn, whose presence, Poirot noted, was unusually fidgety. Dunn's gaze flitted to the empty case as though he expected it to reappear by magic. His jacket was smeared with a faint trace of red fruit pulp, perhaps, or something else. Poirot's mustache twitched at that moment. A sudden breeze stirred the pavilion curtains, and a piercing scream broke the taut silence. Guests gasped as the young lady in lavender, Miss Eleanor Foster, stumbled backward, hands pressed to her throat. A small glass vial rolled from her grasp, its contents oozing a dark crimson stain across the carpet. Poirot sprang forward, moving with the speed of a man accustomed to crises. He knelt beside her, gently prying her fingers apart. The vial bore no label, and the crimson liquid spread like a warning against the white fabric. The crowd recoiled, uncertain whether to flee or stay. Colonel Montague barked for assistance, while Mrs. Aldridge rushed forward with smelling salts. Poirot examined the vial. Poison. He wondered aloud, voice low. He turned to Mrs. Aldridge. Madame, secure all the refreshments immediately. No one touches another drop. He stood, eyes sweeping the crowd, now doubled in unease. Mzamas, our morning has taken a darker turn, but the first clues are in hand. A missing horseshoe, a stray nail, footprints betrayed, and now a vial of unknown contents. He paused, letting the gravity of the scene sink in. The bright facade of gaiety was gone, replaced by suspicions. Cold shadow, yet within that shadow, Poirot's little grey cells buzzed with life, piecing together the patterns no one else could yet discern. Remain calm, he advised softly. I shall uncover the truth. The crowd, unsettled but transfixed, watched as Poirot calmly lifted the vial and placed it beside the evidence bag on the display table. And there, amid spilled crimson and whispered fears, the true investigation began. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects. The pall of suspicion settled over Marlford Hall as Colonel Montague and Mrs. Aldie Ridge ushered the guests from the pavilion into the grand drawing-room. The mahogany doors closed with a sonorous thud, sealing in more than just the morning light. Poirot stood in the centre of the room, hands clasped behind his back, surveying the assembled party. Each face held its own contradictions, some masked by polite smiles, others betrayed by restless glances. Lady Winthrop stood near the hearth, her pale blue gown rippling like water as she shifted from foot to foot. Even in the company of her closest friends, she seemed alone, adrift in a sea of whispered accusations. To her right, Colonel Montague leaned against a marble pillar, arms folded, eyes narrowed in contemplative scrutiny. He was the picture of military reserve, yet Poirot detected a subtle tremor in the twitch of his jaw. Was it impatience, fear, or guilt? Miss Eloise Blythe sat on a chaise longue by the ornate French window, her novelist's mind no doubt already spinning dramatic scenarios from the morning's chaos. She tapped her slender fingers against the silk upholstery, eyes bright with curiosity. Poirot remembered how adept she was at reading human nature, an ally, perhaps, or a competitor in unraveling truths. At the far end of the room gathered the lesser guests. Mr. Frederick Dunn. The jockey whose stained jacket bore an imprint of red that might be fruit or blood. Miss Eleanor Foster, recovering from her shock and murmuring apologies as she dabbed at her lavender dress. Mr. Arthur Penrose. A bookmaker whose shifty eyes darted between the horseshoe's empty case and the closed curtains, and Mrs. Agatha Smythe, the county genealogist, clutching her leather-bound notebook as though it contained the key to family secrets. Finally, in a dark corner stood Dr. Lionel Havisham, the local physician summoned to attend to Miss Foster's distress, his medical bag unopened at his feet. Poirot raised a slender hand to restore order. Amos, we find ourselves in an unfortunate predicament, yet one that can be resolved. Let us introduce ourselves in turn, so that each of us may explain our precise whereabouts and actions at the moment the horseshoe vanished. He inclined his head toward Lady Winthrop. Madam, as the owner of Marlford Hall, you must speak first. Lady Winthrop inhaled sharply, then recounted how she had greeted Mrs. Smythe at the entrance, pausing to extend her condolences upon learning of a distant cousin's passing. She had then moved to inspect the ribbons on display, only to hear Mrs. Aldridge's exclamation moments before noticing the absent artifact, when pressed by Poirot about the tremor in her hand. She admitted she had been nursing a headache. Claim Colonel Montague quickly corroborated, though his tone suggested he resented the perceived invitation to play nurse. Poirot nodded, his mustache bristling with thought. He turned to Colonel Montague. The colonel detailed how he had been speaking with Miss Blythe regarding the lineage of Nightingale's pride and the horse's famous victories. He insisted he had stepped away only briefly to examine a set of commemorative trophies across the room. When Poirot pointed out that the trophies bore no fingerprints save for his own, the colonel's eyes flickered. He explained that only he had handled them, wishing to verify the engravings for accuracy in his memoirs. Miss Blythe rose. Then, offering her account, she had been sketching the pavilion's layout for her upcoming novel and claimed to have looked down at her notepad at the precise instant the theft occurred. Yet her sketch showed the horseshoe still in place. Curiously, that very moment, page was torn out of her notebook, leaving only a ragged edge. When Poirot asked about the missing page, her nimble fingers smoothed her skirt, and she replied with a demure smile, "Such inspiration can be fleeting, monsieur." Mr. Frederick Dunn bustled forward next, sweat beading on his brow. He insisted. He had been adjusting his jacket-tan explanation for the red stain, which he claimed was from his morning's strawberry tart. Poirot raised the recovered nail and asked Dunn if he recognized it, but the jockey stared blankly and shook his head vehemently. "I know nothing of it," he protested. Yet when Poirot observed that Dunn's gloves bore a matching tear too, the velvet cushions fray, a bead of crimson perspiration slipped down Dunn's temple. Miss Foster, still pale from her ordeal, described how she had been retrieving her smelling salts when she discovered the vial. She emphasized that she had never handled the horseshoe case itself, and that the vial was a separate curiosity, a new elixir she claimed to be developing for her chemist brother. Poirot's raised eyebrow betrayed his doubt. The vial's contents were not medicinal. Mrs. Aldridge confirmed it was not among the Hall's legion of approved remedies. Next came Mr. Arthur Penrose, who spoke with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to calculating odds. He admitted he had been inspecting the betting forms displayed on a side table, tallying potential payouts. Poirot inquired whether Penrose had moved toward the horseshoe case, and Penrose's posture stiffened. He conceded that he had approached it twice, but only to assure Lady Winthrop that the week's stakes had been fair. His crisp suit showed no sign of soil or wear. though his polished shoes glinted ominously under the chandelier's light. Mrs. Smythe, the genealogist, provided her statement with scholarly precision. She had been comparing family crests in her notebook, cross-referencing them with Lady Winthrop's lineage. Poirot noticed that her notes contained an entry for Winthrop, missing her 1874, under which she had scribbled a query. Questionable mail lines. When asked why she thought to probe such delicate matters at a social gala, Mrs. Smythe offered only a shaky smile and said that history must be accounted for, whatever the occasion. Finally, Dr. Havisham explained his presence. He had been called at dawn to tend Miss Foster's mild ailment. He diagnosed nothing more serious than nerves and a touch of indigestion. Poirot examined the doctor's hands, immaculate, save for a faint smudge of red beneath his fingernail. When asked, Havisham lifted his glove to reveal a scrap of lavender fabric stuck beneath his thumbnail, the exact hue of Miss Foster's gown. He claimed it was from his examination. As he steadied her arm, Poirot listened patiently, absorbing each recounting, each pause and hesitation. When the final statement was made, he swept his gaze across the room. You see, Mzamas, in this assembly lies both thief and poisoner, perhaps one and the same. Each of you has motives. Each of you has opportunity. He raised the horseshoe. Mail, now sealed in its evidence pouch. But it is not merely the lifting of one prize that I seek to understand. It is the fracturing of trust, the fissures in character that reveal the culprit. A soft click echoed as the drawing-room's French doors opened to admit George, Poirot's valet, carrying an elegantly bound ledger. Poirot took it and flipped to a marked page. I trust you will pardon me if I review these ledger entries, Monsieur Penrose, for I suspect discrepancies in the financial records may shed light upon our mystery. He placed the ledger on a small side table and motioned for the guests to gather round. The suspects, uneasy yet compelled, closed in. Poirot's gloved hand hovered above the open page, his eyes alight with the promise of revelation. Outside, the wind moaned against the shutters, as though mourning the horseshoe's loss. Inside, a much darker drama began to unfold. Chapter 4. Poirot closed the leather-bound ledger with a gentle snap, the sound resonating through the drawing-room like the final chord of a symphony. He straightened his cravat, adjusted the lapels of his waistcoat, and allowed his gaze to sweep over the assembled company with commanding calm. In that instant, the idle chatter and nervous rustling ceased. Every eye turned to the little Belgian and knew that the true investigation had begun in earnest. Mzamas, Poirot began, his voice smooth yet carrying the weight of authority. You have all given your accounts, and I thank you. Mace there inconsistencies that demand our attention. He stepped to the ledger laid open upon the side table and tapped a slender gloved finger against a line of figures. Monsieur Penrose, he said, turning to the bookmaker, you recorded bets totaling 300 guineas on the outcome of the gala's feature race. Yet your ledger shows no corresponding payouts for Mrs. Winthrop's winning wager. Pray, explain this discrepancy. Arthur Penrose's face flushed. He scrubbed at his polished mustache. I must have overlooked the entry, monsieur. I assure you, the payout will be made. He stammered. Poirot's mustache twitched appreciatively. "'Tis been. I shall hold you to that promise. In the meantime, note that the horseshoe bears no practical monetary value. Its worth is purely sentimental. Therefore, the motivation here is not financial gain, but something far more personal." Lady Winthrop drew a slow breath, her pale eyes flickering to Penrose, then away. Colonel Montague shifted his weight, as though sudden guilt had struck him. Though his composure remained outwardly intact, Poirot turned to Miss Blythe, who perched on the edge of an armchair, sketchbook in hand. "Mademoiselle, you spoke of a missing page from your notebook. Might I see the rest of your sketches?" She handed him the slim pad. He leafed through hastily drawn pavilion layouts, diagrams of foot traffic patterns, and margin notes, high-stakes hidden motive. At the back, a hastily scrawled map of service corridors caught his eye. You were aware that beneath this room lies a network of passages. He observed calmly. Miss Blythe tilted her head. I noticed a loose floorboard near the display. Thought it an interesting detail for atmosphere. Her voice betrayed no fear, only amused detachment. Poirot studied her closely. An astute observation. Mademoiselle, yet your timing was perfect. You sketched as the horseshoe vanished. Correct. She smiled, then faltered. One must be precise in one's art. Monsieur. He replaced the notebook and turned to Mr. Dunn, the jockey, who hovered anxiously near the hearth. Monsieur Dunn, you spoke of strawberry tart and red stains, yet your riding silks are kept separate from your gala attire. Why would you dine here before mounting the winner's circle? Dunn stammered that he had nibbled. To settle nerves. Poirot nodded but glanced at the tart fragments on a nearby serviette, the same deep red as the smear on Dunn's jacket cuff. Each Very well. Poirot folded his arms. Now, Dr. Havisham. You examined Miss Foster and found nothing but nerves. Yet your bag contains no instruments save smelling salts and record forms. How, then, does a physician explain the residue of a potent toxin in that vial? Havisham cleared his throat. Gloves tightening on medical bag. I administered only aromatics, monsieur. The vial was in Miss Foster's own purse when she fell. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Then the vial was placed after her collapse. He murmured. He turned to Miss Foster. Mademoiselle, you have chemistry in your blood, you say, but poison is no mere curiosity. You claim to develop elixirs, yet your brother is the only chemist in your family. His laboratory is miles away in London. How, then, did you procure this substance overnight? Her gaze dropped. I ordered it through a contact, she whispered, but I never meant harm. Poirot's expression was unreadable. He paused, taking in the quartet of suspects whose stories frayed at the edges. Then, raising his hand slightly, he addressed them all. The crime was executed with precision, the horseshoe removed without alarm, the nail dropped as an afterthought, and a diversion staged via the vial's appearance. This required planning, inside knowledge of both Malford Hall and its inhabitants, and the skill to move unseen. He advanced to the window. The morning light had shifted. The pavilion beyond appeared calm once more, belying the turmoil within. Poirot turned, hands clasped before him. Let us consider motive. Madam, you stand to lose your family's legacy should the horseshoe be compromised. Colonel. Your memoirs rely on maintaining this Hall's reputation. Monsieur Penrose. Your livelihood depends on trust in fair play. Mademoiselle Blythe, a sensational scoop would elevate your career. Monsieur Dunn, a return favour from Lady Winthrop could enhance your standing. Dr. Havisham, a scandal would destroy your practice. Mademoiselle Foster, closure of your brother's lab could ruin him. Suspects inhaled sharply. Poirot's systematic enumeration of their stakes laid bare the tangled web of interests. He lifted a slender finger. Yet only one of you is both willing and able to stage such an elegant theft. Now, I request stand. Insist that each of you remain within Malford's walls until this matter is resolved. No one departs until I determine who among you handled the horseshoe and why. He allowed a brief smile. Do not think of this as imprisonment, Msamas, but as a most necessary precaution. Colonel Montag's rigid posture loosened fractionally. Penrose's composure cracked. Blyther's lips quivered in restrained excitement. Dunn's face reddened. Foster covered her mouth, eyes wide. Havisham's jaw clenched. Poirot paced slowly back to the side table where the evidence bag lay open. He retrieved the horseshoe nail and held it before him like a beacon. This small iron fragment, he said softly, will guide my little grey cells through the labyrinth of half-truths and deceptions, and from these humble beginnings we shall ascend to the truth. He placed the nail in his pocket and turned to George. Fetch me some coffee, mon ami, and perhaps a plate of tarts for our guests. Investigation, like any delicate art, requires proper refreshments. As George departed, Poirot addressed the room with his characteristic flourish. Let us take a brief respite, then resume our inquiries. There are questions yet unasked, observations yet unmade, and mysteries yet to be unearthed. In that moment, the suspects realized that the grandeur of Marlford Hall was but the stage for a deeper drama, one in which every gesture, every glance, and every hidden motive would come under the relentless scrutiny of Hercule Poirot. And as they dispersed to recover composure and perhaps to exchange furtive accusations, Poirot's silhouette stood resolute, a calm island amidst the storm of suspicion he had so deftly summoned. Chapter 5. Initial interviews began withdrawing. Room's heavy curtains were drawn, muting the glare of midday sun, and an air of expectancy settled over Marlford Hall. Poirot motioned for each suspect to enter his temporary study in turn, where the tall oak desk and its array of notebooks awaited him. He invited Lady Winthrop first. Seating her opposite him on a cushioned chair, the French doors closed behind her with a soft click, leaving them alone in the quiet hush. "Madam," Poirot began, folding his hands, "I wish to explore your relationship with the horseshoe's previous owner, Sir Reginald Winthrop. You wore mourning, yet you inherited no title. Why is that?" Lady Winthrop's composure flickered. "Sir Reginald was my brother by law, not by blood," she said. "He left me guardianship of his estate, but withheld the title for reasons I never understood." Her voice trembled slightly. "He feared scandal, something hidden in our family's past." Poirot leaned forward. "Did you discover this secret?" She hesitated, glancing at the ledger on his desk. "Only hints," she admitted. "Sir Reginald spoke to me of a concealed disgrace, but he died before revealing more." Poirot nodded, filing away her answer. Next came Colonel Montague, who entered with rigid bearing. Poirot offered him a cup of tea, which the colonel accepted with a curt nod. "You testified to examining the trophies during the theft," Poirot said, watching the colonel's fingers wrap tightly around the porcelain. "Yet your boots bear no sign of soil, despite the footprints outside. How did you move about unnoticed?" The colonel's eyes narrowed. "I stepped lightly," he answered crisply. "My training." He paused. "If I wished to steal something, I would not choose an item so fragile." "A horseshoe is heavy and awkward." Poirot's lips curved faintly. Yet the thief made no mistake in handling it. The colonel shifted. "Perhaps the thief possesses equestrian expertise." Poirot made a small note. "Miss Eloise Blythe next." Her sketchbook clasped her chest. She perched on the edge of the chair, offering him a bright, teasing smile. "Monsieur Poirot, I confess my interest in the Venue's architecture might appear suspicious," she said. "But I only wished to capture the interplay of light and shadow." Poirot studied her, tapping his pencil. "And yet you chose to tear out the page that would have shown the horseshoe in its place." Blythe's smile faded. "Our artistic revision," she murmured. "I discard what does not serve the mood." She held his gaze steadily. "I assure you, I value truth more than distractions." Poirot's eyes glittered. "We shall see." Mr. Frederick Dunn, the jockey, was next. He fidgeted in his seat, sweating despite the chill in the room. Poirot placed a small dish of strawberry tarts on the desk and motioned to them. "Please help yourself, monsieur," he said politely. Dunn obeyed, nibbling a corner of a tart. "You claimed the stain on your jacket was fruit," Poirot observed. "Yet the tart in your hand is dry, no juice drips." Dunn froze. tied halfway to his mouth. He swallowed nervously. Perhaps I wiped it off. Porritt regarded him calmly. Or the juice was merely a convenient excuse. Dunn's breathing quickened. I meant no harm. I simply admired the horseshoe and thought to hold it. Porritt raised an eyebrow. Admiration is not theft. Dunn's shoulders slumped. Yes, monsieur. When Dr. Lionel Havisham arrived, Porritt noted the doctor's immaculate gloves and steady breath. Dr. Havisham, you treated Miss Foster this morning. Porritt began. Yet you did not recognize the vial's contents as poisonous. Havisham's brow furrowed. It was disguised as cordial. He produced a small glass with residual liquid. I tested only for bitterness. Porritt tapped the vial on the desk. The poison here is colorless and odorless until contact with iron. Havisham looked crestfallen. I trusted Mademoiselle Foster. Porritt leaned back, and yet the victim merely succumbed. Finally, Miss Eleanor Foster entered. Trembling, Porritt offered her a soothing cup of tea and noted the faint lavender scent clinging to her gloves. Mademoiselle Foster, he began, you claim to develop elixirs for your brother's laboratory. Yet this poison is not medicinal. She pressed her lips together. He procured compounds for experimental tinctures. Porritt nodded slowly. Did you know it could kill? She looked away. I believed it to be a heart tonic. A mistake, nothing more, Porritt observed. Her pale face, a grave mistake. As each interview ended, Porritt retired to his desk, consulting his notes. He reviewed Lady Winthrop's hidden family shame, Colonel Montauk's equestrian skill, Blyther's deleted sketch, Dunn's tart tissue, Havisham's overlooked test, and Foster's misguided vial. Each account contained truth and half-truth, motive and alibi entwined in a knot he must unravel. He folded his hands and closed his eyes for a moment. Outside, the distant hum of carriages and the murmur of unsettled guests drifted through the closed doors. Porritt's grey cell stood, piecing together fragments invisible to all but him. The initial interviews were complete. The suspects had spoken. Now the real work began. He tapped his desk once, decisively, and summoned George. Fetch my magnifying glass and the ledger of local carriage schedules, Porritt instructed. I shall examine tire tracks and visitor logs. There are truths still concealed beneath layers of polite society. George inclined his head and left the room, leaving Porritt alone with the artifacts of deception and a gathering storm of secrets yet to be revealed. Chapter 6. First false led be the late afternoon. The corridors of Marlford Hall had filled with the low rumble of mounted constables and the hurried whispers of household staff. The local inspector, a stout man with a perpetually furrowed brow, had arrived at Porritt's insistence to secure the scene. Under the inspector's direction, evidence was catalogued, and one suspect was singled out as the apparent culprit. All signs pointed to Mr. Frederick Dunn, the jockey whose nervous glances and crimson-stained jacket had drawn Porritt's scrutiny. Inspector Talbot presented his case in the grand drawing-room, where the remaining guests watched with anxious fascination. We have found, he announced, producing a battered riding crop, a set of partial prints matching the pattern of Mr. Dunn's gloves on the velvet cushion. Furthermore, the horseshoe nail bears a fingerprint that our expert confirms belongs to him. He tapped the nail, now sealed in a glass vial, circumstantial though it may seem. The convergence of motive, opportunity, and physical evidence compels us to detain Mr. Dunn pending charges. A hush fell as the constables moved forward. Dunn's shoulders slumped. His eyes, once defiant, now brimmed with tears. He stammered an apology, protesting that he had only meant to admire the horseshoe's craftsmanship. Lady Winthrop itself turned away in silent dismay, and Colonel Montague folded his arms with a grim expression. Miss Blythe covered her mouth in shock, while Miss Foster sank into a chair. Trembling, even Dr. Havisham looked uneasy, as though uncertain he had administered justice rather than remedy. Yet amidst the tableau of accusation, Porritt remained impassive. He watched Dunn be led away, cape swirling, the ridged sole of his boot leaving a final mark on the polished parquet. Porritt's little grey cells seemed to spin in deeper thought. The evidence was compelling, yet something did not sit right. He rose from his seat and approached the inspector, who nodded briskly at him. "Inspector," Porritt said quietly, "I do not deny that the prints match, nor that Mr. Dunn handled the horseshoe. But consider the timing the theft occurred at. The exact instant Miss Blyther's drawing fell to the floor far from the display table. Mr. Dunn could not possibly have been in two places at once." Talbot frowned. "Monsieur Porritt, I appreciate your perspective, but our expert—" Porritt held up a hand. "Our expert did not note that the glove tier matches the frayed velvet in size, but not in alignment. The fray ran horizontally, whereas the glove tier runs vertically. A curious discrepancy." Inspector Talbot's brow deepened, but he shook his head. "I fear that is beyond our scope. The evidence as presented is sufficient." He turned to Mrs. Aldrich. "See that Mr. Dunn is taken to the local cells immediately." The housekeeper bowed, her expression sorrowful. Dunn, pale but composed, gave Porritt a lingering look as he passed a look of both despair and gratitude as the last constable closed the drawing-room door behind him. Porritt remained alone with the dented riding crop and the horseshoe nail. He traced the pattern on the crop's worn handle, a subtle zigzag of leather grain that suggested frequent use and careful maintenance. The nail, tucked into his pocket, felt heavier than its size warranted, burdened by the weight of misdirected blame. He exhaled softly. Porritt walked to the window, drawing back the heavy curtains. The waning light revealed the empty pavilion beyond, its white canvas draped with shadows. A single set of footprints led away from the back entrance toward the stables, a set that did not match Dunn's neat racing boots, but rather the worn sole of someone accustomed to trudging quietly, day after day. He pressed his gloved hand to the glass, noting the sole's cracked edge. The inspector's rushed resolution, though logical on the surface, had obscured a deeper truth. Porritt's mustache twitched in sympathetic frustration at Dunn's predicament. He had been the perfect scapegoat, a nervous outsider with motive enough to covet Lady Winthrop's favor, and the physical evidence seemingly confirming his guilt. Yet Porritt sensed the real thief was still at large, striking again at the heart of Mulford's tranquility. Drawing back from the window, Porritt spoke softly to the empty room, as though confiding in its silent walls. "No, non, mon ami, this is but a diversion. The true culprit applauds the clever ruse, but I shall not be deceived." He stepped to the oak desk and retrieved his notebook, in which he had sketched the footprint pattern from outside and jotted a single phrase: "Worn sole, not racing gait." With resolve sharpening his features, Porritt snapped the notebook closed. The first lead had proved deceiving, yet within its falsehood lay the kernel of a more certain path. The jockey's continued detention would quiet the whole, but Porritt intended to pursue the true trail, however faint it might be, into the stables, the corridors, and the very hearts of those who still stood free. And so, with a measured step, he turned toward the door, ready for the next phase of his investigation. Chapter 7. The psychological gamut. Waning light cast long shadows through the tall windows of Mulford Hall's drawing-roomers. Porritt reassembled the 5 remaining suspects: Lady Winthrop, Colonel Montague, Miss Blythe, Mrs. Smythe, and Dr. Havisham. The air crackled with tension, each guest acutely aware that their next words might betray far more than they intended. Porritt settled into his chair, steepling his fingers, and offered them each a measured smile. "Msamas," he began quietly, We have pursued the first lead and found it false. Our friend Monsieur Dunn remains detained, but I suspect he is not our true adversary. It is now time to engage in a different kind of inquiry, a battle of wits, where words become weapons. He tapped his cane lightly on the parquet, drawing. Their eyes, let us play a small game of observation. I shall make a statement, and I wish each of you to respond without hesitation. Your instinctive reactions will be most instructive. He turned first to Lady Winthrop. Madam, imagine the horseshoe were returned by an anonymous benefactor with no explanation. How would you feel? Lady Winthrop's lips pressed together. She hesitated, eyes glancing toward the curtained windows, relieved. Of course, she said at last, but I would be very grateful yet uneasy, as though salvation came with a price. Her fingers drummed against a skirt. Porret inclined his head. Precisely. Relief tainted by suspicion, and you, Colonel, the retired soldier's jaw tightened. I would be suspicious of a staged maneuver, he replied with clipped formality. An act so dramatic could mask a greater threat. His posture remained rigid, but Porret noted the slight tremor in his left hand. Miss Blythe leaned forward. I would examine it for forgery. Monsieur, a returned artifact might carry telltale inconsistencies, an imperfect patina or mismatched nail. She tapped the lid of her sketchbook. Truth hides in detail. Porret's mustache twitched. In approval. Mrs. Smythe adjusted her spectacles. I would research its provenance. A returned heirloom may reveal long-lost connections, perhaps uncovering a forgotten branch of the Winthrop family. Her scholarly tone belied a sharper curiosity beneath. Finally, Dr. Havisham sat back, fingers laced. I would test it for tampering, looking for chemical traces, perhaps residual oils indicating recent handling. He regarded Porret coolly. One cannot trust appearances. Porret's eyes swept the circle. Very good. Each of you instinctively focused on an aspect that aligns with your own expertise. He paused, letting the weight of that observation sink in. Now, consider this. The true thief did not return the horseshoe. Instead, they left us a nail and a vial. Which of my scenario-based responses most closely mirrors the culprit's own psyche? Silence fell. Lady Winthrop flushed. Colonel Montague shifted his gaze downward. Blythe's lips parted as if she wished to speak, but thought better of it. Mrs. Smythe's fingers tapped the armrest in a rapid, nervous rhythm. Only Havisham met Porret's gaze steadily, expression inscrutable. Porret leaned forward. Dr. Havisham, you would test for chemical traces, but the nail bears only a faint fingerprint, and the vial's poison was activated by iron. Someone anticipated the doctor's methods and used them to mislead us. The doctor's steady calm wavered for a heartbeat. Porret turned to the others. But which among you anticipated my little game? Who imagined I would draw out your professional biases to expose the mind behind the crime? He rose, moving with deliberate slowness toward Mrs. Smythe. You spoke of genealogy seeking hidden family ties yet. You overlooked the possibility that the greatest family secret lies not in heritage, but in deception. He tapped her notebook. You wrote of a missing heir in 1874. Yet the real missing piece is here and now. Mrs. Smythe's mouth opened, closed, and a flush of indignation spread across her cheeks. Monsieur, I only sought the truth of lineage. She protested, voice trembling. I did not. Her protest trailed off. Porret directed his attention to Miss Blythe. And you, with your artist's eye, you tore out the page that recorded the horseshoe's location, but you preserved the corridor sketch suggesting you know how to access it afterwards. Blythe pressed her palm to her mouth. I sketched. What interested me? But what interests you, mademoiselle, is the interplay of concealment and revelation. Porret's gaze flicked to the window. Our thief moved through these corridors unseen. guided by knowledge of hidden passages. Your sketch confirms you knew where to step. Colonel Montag's knuckles whitened round the arm of his chair. "Are you accusing me, Monsieur Poirot?" he demanded, voice measured but strained. Poirot circled to stand before him. "You know the history of this hole intimately. You served here as a young officer. You say, mapping its layout for quarters. You know every corridor, every loose floorboard, yet you feigned ignorance when I questioned you earlier." The colonel's eyes narrowed, but before he could reply, Poirot's gaze shifted to Lady Winthrop. "Madame, you feigned a headache at precisely the wrong moment, drawing sympathy rather than suspicion. You claimed no knowledge of the poison yet. You possessed the evening's menu listing, hors d'oeuvres containing not all, which when mixed with our poison, would appear innocuous. Your headache was no accident. It was a pretext to ensure the vial drew attention to another. Lady Winthrop sank back, her regal mask cracking. "You have no proof," she cried. Poirot nodded gravely. "Proof, madam, shall come in due time. For now, observe how each of you reveal the essence of your trade. The soldier's caution, the scholar's curiosity, the artist's eye, the doctor's analysis, and the lady's command of sympathy." He lifted a hand, and one of you used those very traits to misdirect us. A murmur ran through the group as Poirot turned again to Dr. Havisham. "You, too, have feigned innocence, but the vial's activation by implies a precise knowledge of your expertise. Only someone who understood both medicine and metallurgy could have crafted such a ruse." The doctor's calm composure shattered. He leapt from his chair. "This is preposterous," he yelled. "I came only to heal." His glove fell to the carpet, revealing a quick bruise on his palm. He looked behind him, as though expecting Basset. Poirot raised a hand, restoring silence. "Monsieur, I suggest you sit. The game is not yet concluded. We are merely testing the players." He gestured to the silent tableau. "I trust you now understand that every reaction you show, every instinct you reveal, give me the key to your motive." He sank back into his chair, steepling his fingers once more. "Let us take a moment to reflect on our own biases, Mzamas. For in the intersection of your professions lies the pattern of the true criminal mind. We shall reconvene shortly, once you have considered your words, your actions, and the hidden spaces in which this crime was born." As the five stood in uneasy contemplation, the walls of Marlford Hall seemed to close in. Outside, the hush of dusk pressed against the panes, while within, Poirot's little grey cells danced with the triumph of psychological insight. The game had begun in earnest, and no one would emerge unscathed. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mistress. Evening meal in Marlford Hall's oak-panelled dining room was a muted affair. The long table, once emblazoned with laughter and the clink of wine-glasses, now bore the weight of suspicion in every folded napkin and half-empty glass. Poirot seated himself at the centre, offering a wry smile as he surveyed the assembly. Lady Winthrop to his right, Colonel Montague and Mrs. Smythe to his left, with Miss Blythe and Dr. Havisham flanking the head of the table. The silverware gleamed beneath the chandelier's light, but no one touched their food. A hush fell as George, Poirot's valet, moved along the table, serving delicate canapes and crystal flutes of champagne. The hushed conversation died when Miss Blythe, lifting a glass, paused mid-bite. Her eyes widened, and she set the morsel back on its plate. "Monsieur," she whispered, voice trembling, "my canape tastes bitter." She swallowed the beverage, sniffed, then shook her head. "There's a metallic tang." Lady Winthrop's lips parted in alarm. "What is it, Eloise?" Colonel Montague stood, his chair scraping the floor. Mrs. Smythe leaned forward, peering at her plate. Dr. Havisham rose to inspect, but Poirot raised a gloved hand. Patience, he said softly. He extracted the remaining canape on a plate and examined its thin crust. Yes, observe the minute crystals glinting here. These are not corsalt, but a powdered compound. He sniffed the plate. Cyanide. Mzamus, a secondary attempt at murder, or at least at chaos. A tremor passed through the guests. Colonel Montague took an involuntary step back. Mrs. Smythe gasped and pressed a hand to her chest. Even Dr. Haversham's practiced calm faltered for a moment. Porritt held up the canape. Note, however, that only the canapes on this side of the table are affected. The side closest to Lady Winthrop's seat is untouched. Our perpetrator chose their victims with care. Miss Blythe whispered, "But I did not eat more than one." She pressed a cool hand to her forehead. "I thought it stale." Porritt replaced the canape upon a side dish. "You were correct to set it aside. You have keen senses. Mademoiselle." He turned to Colonel Montague. "Colonel, you were the first to rise. Did you notice anything as you moved?" The colonel swallowed, only that the footman had paused at each place-setting longer than necessary. He glanced toward George, who stood at a respectful distance. He hesitated before I was served. Porritt's eyes flicked to the valet, whose posture remained rigidly professional. "Mon brave George," Porritt said, "you serve with precision. Yet earlier, you hesitated before placing the canapes. Why?" George's composure cracked for an instant. "Monsieur, my apologies. I thought I saw a smell on the tray." But I dared not question Lady Winthrop's orders. His gaze darted to Lady Winthrop, whose expression was unreadable. Porritt set aside the glass and summoned a silver crute. He squeezed a drop of vinegar onto the canape's surface. The crystals fizzed, leaving a pale residue. Cyanide dissolves into a fine, bitter powder when mixed with vinegar. Our culprit must have had access to the kitchen larder and to a source of this poison. He replaced the dish and turned to Dr. Haversham. "You affirmed that the vial's contents were not medicinal, yet you, as physician, could easily procure such substances for harmless-seeming experiments. I trust you can account for every such compound brought to Mulford today." The doctor's breath hitched. "I catalogued only the smelling salts." Porritt's mustache twitched. "And yet cyanide is not a substance one keeps in a domestic infirmary. It suggests more sinister preparations." He rose and paced between the chairs. "This secondary mystery and attempted poisoning shifts our investigation. The intended victim was not Lady Winthrop, for her plate was safe instead. Miss Blythe and Colonel Montague may have been targets for intimidation." He placed a hand on the colonel's shoulder. Montag's stiff posture slackened. "Consider, too, the timing." Porritt continued. "The dinner commenced at precisely 7 o'clock. We had just resumed discourse after my psychological exercise. The perpetrator used that pause as cover, slipping behind the footman's back and dusting the canapes." He paused, scanning each face. "Only someone familiar with the hall's routines could have moved unseen, someone among us, or someone with implicit trust." Mrs. Smythe cleared her throat. "Monsieur, if I may, who stands to benefit from silencing certain voices? The genealogist's inquiries might uncover a scandal that threatens a reputation. The jockey's silence is secured by his detention. But we observe that Miss Blythe is unharmed, though she is perhaps most likely to report the incident in vivid prose if she suffered more severely." Porritt nodded thoughtfully. "An excellent point. Yet threatening Miss Blythe with faint poison suggests the culprit wished to scare rather than to kill. A warning shot, to induce fear." He looked to Miss Blythe. "Your talents as a novelist are well known. Perhaps you can imagine why someone would employ such a tactic." Miss Blythe swallowed, gaze fixed on the tablecloth. "My work is built on drama, monsieur. but I cannot see who here would fear my pen so greatly." She shook her head. Porret turned to Lady Winthrop, leaning in close. "Madam, your calm under threat is remarkable. Few would dismiss an attempt on their guests so lightly." Lady Winthrop glanced round, then back at Porret. "I would not have a scandal at my table. The whole's reputation must endure." Her voice was low, almost brittle. He drew back and closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of her words. Opening them, he addressed the room. "Msamus, this secondary Mr. Lake. The first was designed to misdirect. We have a vanished horseshoe, a vial of poison staged for shock, and now a false attempt at poisoning during dinner. The common thread is the manipulation of our senses, sight, taste, and fear." He lifted a hand. "Come open. I propose we adjourn here. Tonight, each of you should rest, for tomorrow we shall examine the hall's hidden kitchens and storerooms. We will inspect the footman's pantries and the cook's larder. We shall analyze the cellar's preserves and the doctor's pharmaceutical stores. And we shall revisit the person whose hesitation served both theft and terror." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Colonel Montague clenched his fists. Mrs. Smythe bit her lip. Miss Blythe's knuckles whitened round her glass. Dr. Haversham's eyes darted to the door. Lady Winthrop's gaze remained steady, but her jaw was set. Porret inclined his head. "Rest well, Msamus, for tomorrow brings the unveiling of truths yet concealed," as he turned to leave. Lady Winthrop whispered, "Monsieur Porret, have mercy on us all." He paused and offered his most gentle smile. "Je n'ai que la vérité en pity." And with that, he departed, leaving Malford Hall to the uneasy shadows of a night fraught with secrets. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections, First Tendrils. Of dawn wove pale light through the mullioned windows of Malford Hall as Porret made his way toward the service wing. The hush of early morning was broken only by George's soft footsteps at his side. The night's shadows still clung to the corners, but Porret's mind shone with clarity today. He intended to unravel the concealed ties that bound suspect to suspect. He paused at the doorway of the deserted kitchen, inhaling the cool, lingering sense of herbs and spice. His single candlestick guttered on the preparation table, illuminating jars of preserves and tall racks of cooking implements. Porret surveyed the room. No sign of the cyanide used the previous evening, yet faint traces of crushed rosemary, a curious flourish indeed. He fingered the fronds, musing on their possible significance, before leading George toward the scullery. There he found the cook, Mrs. Davenport, an elderly woman whose hands trembled as she rinsed pans. She curtsied when Porret entered, but averted her gaze. "Bonne journée, monsieur," she murmured. "I trust the breakfast arrangements satisfy you." Porret inclined his head. "Merci, madame. You are not responsible for any tampering last night, are you?" Her eyes widened. "God forbid, monsieur. I keep no poison in my larder, but I did notice someone in the pantry late last night, Madam Smythe. I believe." Porret nodded. "Thank you." As Mrs. Davenport hurried away, he turned to George. "Note that Mrs. Smythe's nocturnal excursion was unreported. We shall return to that." He made a careful mental note before descending the narrow servants' staircase, emerging into the dank undercroft of the hall. The underground passages smelled of damp stone and distant echoes. Porret smiled inwardly. His earlier sketch by Miss Blythe had guided him here. He traced the walls until reaching a small iron door marked only by a faded emblem. He rapped softly, no answer. George fetched a skeleton key, and Porret slipped the door open, revealing a hidden wine cellar, barrels of claret and port-lined. The walls, and in one corner, a locked chest bore Lady Winthrop's initials. He undid the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside lay documents, personal letters between Lady Winthrop and Colonel Montague, heavy with clandestine sentiment. One note spoke of shared confidences regarding the Hall's financial woes. Another hinted at a promise to safeguard a certain family heirloom. Poirot's mustache quivered. The lady and the colonel were connected by more than hospitality. They were bound by secret obligations. Reassembling the letters, Poirot murmured. A hidden alliance formed in desperation. He pocketed the correspondence and relocked the chest, replacing the barrel before closing the door. As he ascended, he wondered whether those private assurances had given the colonel motive enough to orchestrate a theft, using the horseshoe as collateral against unspoken debts. In the corridor above, he encountered Mrs. Smythe herself, her scholarly features pale in the flickering torchlight. "Madam," Poirot greeted calmly, "I understand you sought the pantry last night." She flinched. "I needed sugar," she stammered, "but the pantry door was locked, and I feared being overheard." Poirot's gaze pierced her. "You were not concerned about sugar, but about that which could dissolve and remain unseen." She looked away. "I meant only to confirm a family recipe," she whispered. Poirot's lips curved. "We shall revisit that claim later." He excused himself, pressing on toward the morning room where Colonel Montague awaited by the hearth. The colonel rose at his approach, cloak still damp from mist. "Monsieur Poirot," he said evenly, "I trust your explorations have been productive." Poirot folded his arms. "I discovered your letters with Lady Winthrop in the wine cellar. You and she share motives beyond false appearances." The colonel's forehead cracked. "Our financial ruin was at stake. I requested her forbearance on certain debts." "That does not prove I stole the horseshoe." Poirot inclined his head. "No, but it illuminates your eagerness to mislead. And yet, you were not alone in seeking recourse." As the colonel fell silent, Poirot proceeded to Lady Winthrop's dressing room. He knocked gently, and she admitted him with trembling hands clutching a gown. The morning's turmoil weighed on her. Poirot produced the recovered letters. "Your friendship with Colonel Montague deepens the list of suspects. But I found also a letter penned by Miss Blythe. Tucked between pages an invitation to dinner from you, praising her discreet talents." Lady Winthrop looked away. "I wished her to embellish the gala in my favour," she said softly. "I did not expect betrayal." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Yet you enlisted her to document the hidden corridors, the very passages used in the theft." The final strand of the web led him to Miss Blythe's chambers, where he found her poring over a sketch of the Hall's floor plan. The torn page of her notebook lay discarded on the desk, and beneath it a small key glinted. Poirot retrieved it. "This unlocks the display case from beneath." She rose, startled. "I intended only to sketch architecture." Her voice wavered. "But I discovered how easily one could lift the horseshoe unseen. I meant to warn you, not to steal." Poirot studied her, discerning truth from fear. "Your conscience troubled you, which is why you provided the sketch to our cook for a safekeeping in the cellar." Blyther's eyes widened. "I thought it safe there." He nodded, pocketing the key. "You and Mrs. Davenport are allies in this chapter, yet both withheld that alliance from us." She nodded, tears brimming. "I was afraid." Poirot's expression softened. "Fear can be as dangerous as deception." He led her back into the corridor. Standing in the hall's great vestibule, Poirot surveyed the 5 suspects. Each bore a hidden tie. The colonel and Lady Winthrop bound by debt. Mrs. Smythe and the cook connected by family law. Blythe and the staff united by curiosity. And even Dr. Havisham woven into confidences of healing. The tapestry of relationships formed a lattice through which the decisive thread still eluded him. He pressed a gloved hand to a Corinthian column and reflected on the patterns of alliance. The act of theft had required more than a single pair of hands. It had needed trust, leverage, and the assurance that the misdirection would hold. Whoever orchestrated it had worked through this web of hidden connections, ensuring each participant served as a pawn in a grander game. With this knowledge, Poirot steeled his resolve. The next revelation would turn these interwoven loyalties into evidence, exposing the mastermind who manipulated them all. He raised his head, eyes alight with purpose. The path is clear. He murmured to George, "Tonight, we draw the strings taut and watch the tapestry unravel," and so. Beneath the marble arches of Marlford Hall, Poirot's little grey cells thrummed with anticipation, ready to seize upon the remaining secrets that lay waiting in the labyrinth of human hearts. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. Midday sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Marlford Hall's library, illuminating rows of leather-bound tomes and casting kaleidoscopic patterns upon the Persian rug. Poirot stood before the tall window seat, revisiting the letters and sketches he had collected. Round him lay the scattered threads of the case, the concealed wine-cellar correspondence, the torn notebook page, the skeleton key, and the frayed horseshoe nail. Yet none seemed decisive until his gaze alighted upon an overlooked detail. He lifted the frayed velvet swatch from his pocket, the very piece Mrs. Aldrich had trimmed from the display case's interior. He held it beside the horseshoe nail, turning the swatch's torn fibers toward the light. There, in the very heart of the tear, he discovered a minute deposit of crimson residue, indistinct at first, but unmistakable upon closer inspection. It was the same bitter compound used in the canapes, a deliberate trace. His subtle smile curved Poirot's lips as his grey cells hummed with recognition. The true thief had not merely stolen the horseshoe. They had introduced poison at a separate moments, first in the vial that threatened Miss Foster, and again in the dinner canapes. The crimson smudge in the kitchen, the tiny smear upon the velvet, all pointed to someone who revelled in psychological manipulation, someone who wanted not only to possess but also to torment. He replaced the swatch and picked up the ledger of carriage schedules from the desk. Across its columns lay the details of every arrival that morning, complete with wheel track impressions, recorded by the stablemaster. One entry, marked by the initials EB, indicated an unscheduled carriage departure at precisely 5:23 a.m., the same window during which the horseshoe vanished. EB could only be Eloise Blythe, yet Miss Blythe had insisted she sketched diagrams, not sneaked away. Poirot's hands moved deftly as he flipped to the page where Hastings had once recorded the measuring of tire widths. He compared the noted with 3.1 inches with the footprint pattern he had drawn in Section 6. The worn sole belonged to a staff shoe, not a carriage wheel. But the carriage departure suggested Miss Blythe had arranged her own transport, ostensibly to depart Marlford early. Why? Brigadier General Blythe, no relation to Eloise, could not be the passenger. The clue lay elsewhere. He closed the ledger and fetched Lady Winthrop's invitation to Miss Blythe. Dated 3 days earlier, the ornate stationery bore a faint watermark of Mrs. Smyther's genealogical society, a symbol of laurel sounding an open book. Mrs. Smythe had access to these seals through her official duties. Yet the invitation was written entirely in Eloise's hand, a forgery crafted to draw the novelist into complicity. Someone had wanted Blythe identified as the early leaver. Poirot straightened, eyes gleaming. The plot was twofold. Frame Miss Blythe as the thief and the poisoner, then distract from the real manipulator who hid behind her artistry. The faint crimson on the velvet matched the same compound found in the kitchen pumice where Mrs. Smythe had brushed rosemary. The genealogist's neatly trip to the pantry had involved more than sugar. She had smeared that compound upon the velvet, ensuring it would adhere in one direction and only one sign pointing to herself. Yet the real mystery resided in the misdirection of Miss Blythe's transport record. The early carriage exit concealed the presence of another passenger, not Eloise, but Dr. Havisham. The doctor's ledger, kept hidden in his medical bag, contained similar entries, but only one departure unaccounted for. Poirot's eyes flicked to the physician's gloved hands, noting the faint scar across the palm, an injury one acquires when handling glass vials. The doctor had poisoned the canapes and planted the crimson in the display case's velvet, seeking to implicate Mrs. Smythe and Miss Blythe interchangeably. As he deliberated, Poirot heard a soft knock. George entered, bearing tea on a silver tray. Poirot lifted the delicate cup and gestured for George to bring him Dr. Haversham's satchel from the anteroom. George hesitated, then obeyed. When the bag arrived, Poirot opened it, revealing neatly organized vials, some labeled antiseptic, others with cryptic chemical symbols. Among them lay a small bottle marked only by a scratched circle. Poirot uncorked it. Dipping a fingertip into the residue, the bitter tang confirmed his suspicion. The same poison. He replaced the cap and fixed George with a look of triumph. "Monsieur," George said quietly. "Shall I fetch the others? Patience, mon ami." Poirot set the vial aside. Dr. Havisham believed himself invisible behind the mask of healing, yet he missed the one flaw that betrays a master manipulator. He underestimated the importance of pattern. He drew the velvet swatch from his pocket and held it aloft. "Observe the orientation of these crushed fibers. They point toward the shelf above the very shelf on which Mrs. Smythe stored her botanical compendium." He moved to the shelf, removing a thick tome of medicinal herbs. Inside, the pages bearing cyanide's description were dog-eared and annotated in the doctor's painstaking script. Yet the doctor had meant the notes for academic interest, not criminal design. The real designer was Mrs. Smythe, who had studied the compendium, then enlisted Dr. Haversham's familiar instruments to execute her vengeance. Poirot replaced the book and returned to the desk. He composed himself, brushing invisible dust from his coat. Then, summoning his unrivaled calm, he opened the library doors. The suspects, Lady Winthrop, Colonel Montague, Miss Blythe, and Mrs. Smythe stood waiting in the corridor, eyes tense with apprehension. "Samus," Poirot intoned, voice steady, "I have discovered a secret clue that will illuminate the course of our investigation." He held the velvet swatch before them, a trace of crimson poison, replicated twice, once here, and once in the dinner canapes, points to the hand that sows terror. Not for profit, but for hidden vengeance. He turned to Mrs. Smythe, whose scholarly composure crumbled. "You made nightly excursions to the pantry, allegedly for sugar. Instead, you tested the distribution of this compound, ensuring that when the horseshoe was removed and the guests repelled, suspicion would swirl among us like autumn leaves in the wind." Miss Smythe's hands trembled. "I did it too." "Expose the doctor," she sobbed. He endangered Miss Foster, and I wished to show his negligence." Poirot inclined his head. "Admirable intent, but flawed execution. You manipulated those round you, using the doctor's tools, the novelist's sketches, and a stolen family heirloom to force your revelation." He paused, turning to Dr. Havisham, who had crept forward with pale face. "And you, Doctor, you provided the means, the poison, the instruments, believing your intent noble. But in the process, you conspired to intimidate, to coerce confessions under threat of death." Dr. Haversham's face fell. "I only wished to ensure justice for Miss Foster. But I never intended to kill." Poirot's expression softened. "Intent does not absolve outcome. You painted fear upon this household, placing lives at risk." He folded his hands. "Our path now becomes clear. The horseshoe's theft was your distraction, the poison, your instrument. Yet the true culprit behind the initial disappearance remains." He looked to Lady Winthrop and Colonel Montague. "You two formed an alliance to stave off ruin, but you did not commit these acts of terror. Miss Blythe, You sketched passageways, but never wielded the poison. He paused, letting the truth settle upon them like a mantle. The theft itself required another hand, one poised between suffering and remedy. A soft gasp. Escape, Miss Blythe. You mean... Porrett's gaze flicked to Colonel Montague. You claimed fear of financial collapse, yet you lacked the heart for cruelty. Lady Winthrop, you inherited family disgrace. But you yearned only to protect the halls. Legacy, no our true thief hid in plain sight. George, your loyal valet. Gasps echoed as George stepped forward, removing his gloves. His fingers bore the same faint scar as the doctor's, but the cut was older, an accident shattered by vigilance. On closer inspection, the gloves bore traces of crimson compound along the cuff. George bowed his head. I acted for love of this house, he confessed softly. I feared for its future. The mine beneath the hall ran empty. Debts threatened foreclosure. I took the horseshoe to sell, hoping to buy time. When Mr. Dunn was detained, I staged the poison to distract suspicion, believing Monsieur Haversham's supplies would suffice to frighten, not kill. Silence reigned. Porrett nodded. Your loyalty betrayed you. Mon ami, you employed the misdirection of Mrs. Smythe and the doctor's unwitting aid. You exploited Miss Blythe's sketches and Lady Winthrop's sanctuary of trust. He turned to the others. Let justice take its course, for each must answer for their deeds. As footsteps echoed down the corridor, Porrett surveyed the tableau. A valet undone by devotion, a genealogist undone by righteousness, a physician undone by zeal, and in the midst stood the silent figure of Lady Winthrop. Her legacy preserved, but her innocence intact, Porrett exhaled softly. His little grey cells had deciphered the secret clue that changed everything, and as the dawn light streamed through the library windows, he allowed himself a moment's quiet triumph, knowing that the game at last had reached its pivotal turning point. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. Mulford Hall seemed to shudder as George, the devoted valet, was led away in gentle custody. The rattling of his footsteps down the corridor echoed through the silent drawing-room where Lady Winthrop, Colonel Montague, Miss Blythe, Mrs. Smythe, and Dr. Haversham remained, each processing the wrenching revelation. Porrett stood near the hearth, hands folded, watching the ripple of shock and betrayal spread across their faces. Lady Winthrop gripped the gilded arm of her chair so tightly that her knuckles whitened. George, he would never, she whispered, voice breaking. Her eyes flicked to Colonel Montague, as if seeking reassurance that his own loyalty would compensate for this treachery. The colonel, in turn, stared at the empty doorway, jaw clenched, mourning the loss of a man he had counted on for years. Miss Blythe pressed her fingertips to her lips, as though afraid to speak lest she unleash further accusations. Her slender frame trembled with indignation, not only at George's betrayal, but at the way her own sketches and observations had been manipulated as part of his scheme. He used me, she said softly. He weaponized my art against us all. Mrs. Smythe, the genealogist, adjusted her spectacles with nervous precision. I never imagined my insistence on midnight pantry visits would be twisted so cruelly, she murmured. I sought only to test for the poison, to protect Miss Foster. Instead, I provided the very means of misdirection. Dr. Haversham's face, once composed, now bore a haunted look. He paced near the mantel, brushing his palm across the velvet cushion that had once held the stolen horseshoe. I believed my actions would reveal negligence, not ruin a life, he said, voice hollow. My science became a weapon I never intended. Porrett raised a hand, gently commanding silence. Samus. He said quietly, we are all wounded by these events, yet our purpose remains, to bring order from chaos and to understand the full measure of what has transpired. He paused, eyes gliding over each suspect. But first, Let us confront the tensions that now bind us. Each of you harbors resentment toward George for his betrayal, toward one another for unwitting complicity, and perhaps toward yourselves. Lady Winthrop inhaled tremulously. I resent myself most of all, she admitted. I trusted George implicitly and entrusted him with my family's legacy. His actions bespeak not hatred, but desperation. She looked up, meeting Poirot's gaze. Yet I cannot forgive the harm he caused. Colonel Montague folded his arms, constricting his dignity into a soldier's mask. I resent George's use of my name, he said stiffly. He stole to settle debts tied to my assurances. I offered him no true recourse, only half promises and the weight of trust. His admission hung heavy in the room. Miss Blyther's cheeks flushed. I resent that my gift for detail was exploited, she said, voice firming. I sketched corridors to capture history, not to abet theft. I failed to safeguard my own work, and thus unwittingly abetted his scheme. Mrs. Smythe exhaled a shuddering breath. I resent that my quest for truth drove me to deception, she confessed. I sought to uncover dangers to Miss Foster, but in doing so I nurtured the very fear I meant to dispel. Dr. Haversham's pace slowed. He folded his hands behind his back, and I resent that my healing knowledge was perverted. He said softly, I tested for a poison, yet my expertise made the threat more credible. I despaired of justice and thus became an accessory to cruelty. Poirot nodded sympathetically. True. Each of you bears a measure of guilt, yet it is through honest acknowledgment that we may proceed. The tensions now rise, but also reveal the fractures in motive and opportunity. He moved toward the window, where a distant shaft of light picked out motes dancing in the morning haze. Let us recall the original crime, the theft of the gilded horseshoe. George confessed to that act, driven by love for this house and fear of its ruin. But the poisoning both in the vial and the canapes was orchestrated to distract and to instill terror. Not all of you acted with malice, but each of your talents was misused. Our task is to disentangle the strands of intention from the acts themselves. Lady Winthrop stood, smoothing her gown. Monsieur Poirot, who now remains suspect, who still moves unseen among us. Her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and resolve. Poirot turned, fixing her with a kindly gaze. The immediate threat has been laid bare. George's confession addresses the theft and the poison's delivery. Yet the original planning and the true mastermind who envisioned this layered deception remains at large. He paused. Who orchestrated this scheme? Who possessed the foresight to enlist the genealogist's curiosity, the physician's tools, and the artist's eye? A hush descended. Colonel Montague's gaze flicked toward Mrs. Smythe. Miss Blyther's eyes found the doctor. Mrs. Smythe's glance travelled to the colonel. Dr. Haversham's features folded in concern. The subtle alliances and hostilities simmered beneath polite expressions. Poirot continued. Consider this, the person who conceived the scheme must have known each of you well, understanding both your virtues and your vulnerabilities. They predicted that Mrs. Smythe would snoop in the pantry, that the doctor would be tempted to test, and that Mademoiselle Blythe would capture the passages in her drawings. The plan relied on your natural inclinations. He approached Mrs. Smythe and took her hand gently. Madam, your midnight pantry visit was a test, but you did not plant the crimson powder. You merely unwittingly confirmed its most likely distribution. You did not know the powder was placed in the display case. Mrs. Smythe nodded, tears glimmering. Poirot stepped to Dr. Haversham. Doctor, you provided the poison and the instruments, but you claimed ignorance of the theft. You did not foresee that George would implicate you so fully. The doctor exhaled, rubbing his temple. He turned to Miss Blythe. Eloise, you sketched the corridors. But you did not facilitate a carriage exit. You were drawn into the scheme. By a forged invitation, Blyther's eyes misted. I see now. Finally, Porritt faced the Colonel and Lady Winthrop together. Your shared debts and secret letters provided the motive, yet neither of you handled the horseshoe. Or placed the poison. Porritt raised a hand, silencing their mutual expressions of shock. You were the bait, the law that beckoned George to act. Yet the architect of this trauma knew you would suffer collapse at its revelations. Thus maximizing the spectacle, a tense stillness enveloped them. Porritt's gaze flicked to a mirror over the mantel, reflecting their anxious faces. The mastermind is among us, yet hidden behind a veil of loyalty or friendship. We must watch for the slightest misstep, an answering glance, a hesitation too late, a confession carried in a furtive breath. Lady Winthrop exhaled, regaining her composure. Then what do we do? Monsieur, she asked softly. Porritt offered, a reassuring smile. We remain vigilant. I shall question each of you anew, but this time with the truths you have revealed. Tensions they rise to expose. As they peak, the true culprit's guilt will burn brightest. He folded his hands, for now. Gather strength, our confrontation draws near, and with it the resolution of this intricate mystery. As the company dispersed to collect themselves, Porritt lingered by the hearth, eyes closed in contemplation, the tension in the air, the very lifeblood of detection pulsed with promise. Soon, the hidden architect of terror would be unmasked, and Marlford Hall would breathe free of fear once more. Chapter 12. The confrontation-lit afternoon light slanted through the tall sash windows of the billiard room, illuminating the green, baize table and casting long, shifting shadows at the edges of the room. Porritt stood behind the table, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the 5 figures ranged before him. Lady Winthrop, Colonel Montague, Miss Blythe, Mrs. Smythe, and Dr. Havisham. The air was taut with expectation, each person aware that, at this moment, their feet rested upon a single misstep. Msamus, Porritt began, voice calm yet resonant. We have examined motives, intercepted misdirections, and traced the tangled connections that bound you all. Now comes the moment of truth, when the pressure of observation compels the guilty to betray themselves. He tapped a billiard cue lightly on the table. I shall speak plainly, and I ask each of you to listen well, for the key to this drama lies in your reactions. He turned first to Colonel Montague. Colonel, you assured us your intentions were honorable, yet your secret debts to Lady Winthrop drove George to desperation. You admit you feared the Hall's ruin. But would you truly see the man you trusted torn from your service? The Colonel's posture stiffened. His jaw clenched as he realized how starkly his motives now appeared. He inclined his head in a measured nod. I would not, he said quietly, voice taut. George was a loyal servant. I regret that my actions forced his hand. Porritt let the silence stretch, then addressed Lady Winthrop. Madam, you feared scandal and loss of reputation. You admitted you sought to protect your family's name. Yet when terror was sown here, you maintained your composure even as others trembled. Does not that steadiness betray a consciousness of your own hidden role? Lady Winthrop inhaled sharply, lips parting as if to protest, but the words died unspoken. Her eyes glistened, and she pressed a hand to her cheek. I only strove to uphold dignity, she whispered. Next, Porritt turned to Mrs. Smythe. Madam, your scholarly zeal led you to test for poison. Though your official capacity required no such investigation, you acknowledged that you sought Miss Foster's safety. Yet you omitted mention of your midnight ventures. Terrified though you were, you returned to the pantry not for sugar, but to confirm your suspicions. What did you hope to find? Mrs. Smythe's fingers trembled round her notebook. She met Porritt's gaze, voice trembling with contrition. "I wished proof before raising alarm. I would not endanger anyone wrongly." Porritt nodded gravely, and focused on Dr. Havisham. "Doctor, you provided the poison and tested only for bitterness. You claim scientific curiosity, yet the cyanide you supplied nearly claimed a life. You believed you administered only a warning. But you armed George with a weapon far deadlier than any carriage whip. Can you deny that such knowledge carries responsibility beyond your medical oath?" The doctor's face paled. He swallowed hard, gaze fixed on the green tablecloth. "I underestimated the consequences. I sought to reveal negligence, but instead weaponized fear." Finally, Porritt looked at Miss Blythe. "Mademoiselle, your artistry captured secret passages and traffic patterns. You tore pages to conceal your sketches, then entrusted them to the cook for safekeeping. You professed innocence. Yet you provided the blueprint for entry and escape. What did you intend to accomplish?" Miss Blythe's slender shoulders drooped. She pressed a hand to her lips before speaking softly. I saw the ease of invisibility and wished only to protect the whole by warning Porritt. I never foresaw George's tragedy." Porritt took a step back. Light from the windows flickered on his polished shoes. "You have all spoken with admirable candor," he said, "yet in speaking, you also revealed your fears, your loyalties, and your roles in this tragedy. Now, let us consider the true architect of this scheme, the one who orchestrated events from behind the scenes, using each of you as instruments in a symphony of deception." He paused, letting each suspect hold his or her breath as though waiting for the final chord. "The mastermind chose the setting, the gala pavilion, knowing the horseshoe's value would lure attention. They planted the vial to rouse suspicion, then used the poisoned canapes to sow terror at dinner. They traced every action to the habits you each cherish: the soldier's caution, the lady's poise, the scholar's probing, the doctor's analysis, and the artist's eye." Porritt's gaze swept the room. But who possessed such knowledge? Who knew the layout of the hall's hidden corridors, its pantry schedules, the doctor's stores, the cook's routines? And Mademoiselle's sketching habits? Colonel Montag's chest rose and fell as though he would speak, but he said nothing. Lady Winthrop's eyelids fluttered uncertainly. Mrs. Smythe shifted on her feet. Dr. Havisham stared at the floor, and Miss Blythe's breath caught. Porritt stepped forward, placing a palm upon the billiard table. "Look round you," he said softly. "Every one of you stood at a point in the house at which you believed yourselves unobserved. Yet you were watched by the one person who knew your every step, your every routine." He lifted his index finger. "The one person who stands among you but never speaks a word in accusation." He closed his eyes briefly, as though hearing the faint echo of George's departing footsteps. Opening them, he said, "The mastermind is the one who remains silent, but whose presence permeates this household. The one you trust above all others, the one who sees without being seen." The occupants of the room exchanged anxious glances, hands reaching to grip the arms of chairs. Porritt's face curved into a knowing smile. "And now, as the tension peaks, I invite our silent observer to break the silence." He stood waiting, arms folded, every line of his body radiating calm expectation, for a long moment. The room held its breath. Then, with the slightest quiver in her voice, Lady Winthrop spoke. "Monsieur Porritt, surely you do not accuse me?" Porritt's gaze remained unwavering as he gestured toward the heavy drapery at the far end of the room. "No, madam, not you. It is someone you hold dear, someone whose voice you would recognize if they spoke." He stepped aside, revealing a tall figure standing in the shadows, a footman, white-jacketed and wide-eyed. All eyes turned to him. Porritt advanced and addressed the silent figure. "My friend, you have watched us, moved unnoticed and guided the flow of events. It was you who lifted the horseshoe, took the nail, and slipped the vial into Miss Foster's pocket. You delivered the poison canates, then retreated. You knew every hour, every hidden path, every serving tray, and in your loyalty to this house, you believed yourself invisible. The footman's face folded in shame. He knelt, head bowed. "Yes, Monsieur Porret," he confessed, voice trembling. "I wanted to protect the Hall's reputation, to preserve our way of life. I thought if I created disturbances, the real threat would be exposed and driven away." A stunned silence followed. Colonel Montague released a breath he did not know he held. Lady Winthrop touched her brow. Mrs. Smythe covered her trembling mouth. Miss Blythe sank into a chair. Cradling her sketchbook, Dr. Havisham pressed a hand to his chest. Porret placed a comforting hand on the footman's shoulder. Votre Lyotte, though misplaced, was earnest. Yet your actions wrought fear and heartbreak. He turned to the others. "You see now, the one who seemed most silent, most removed, was the one who observed all, and in observing, he believed he could manipulate you unchallenged. He stepped back, hands folded, thus. The confrontation truly concludes not with dramatic accusation, but with the silent admission of one who thought himself a guardian, and who must now answer for his deeds." As the footman was gently led away, the heavy tension in the room dissolved into a hush of relief and grief. Porret surveyed the assembly with gentle compassion. "Samus, the game is not yet finished. We have confirmed the thief, the poisoner, and the mastermind. Yet we must still uncover every motive, every regret, and restore the harmony of this home. Our next task awaits." And with that, Porret's little grey cells prepared for the final revelations that would bring justice and peace back to Malvern Hall. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape the hush that followed the footman's confession was shattered by a sudden crash from the doorway. Colonel Montague sprang forward as the window at the far end of the billiard room exploded inward, shards of glass tinkling across the floor like sinister raindrops. A figure darted through the opening, a slim silhouette clad in the footman's livery, and bolted toward the corridor. After him, Porret commanded, voice crisp. The remaining guests hesitated only an instant before scrambling to their feet. Porret himself glided ahead, cane tapping the parquet in measured pursuit. They surged into the hallway as the figure vanished round a corner. Lady Winthrop clutched her skirts, breathless. Miss Blythe gripped Colonel Montague's arm, eyes wide. Mrs. Smythe adjusted her spectacles, and Dr. Havisham pushed past them with surprising urgency. Porret led them down the corridor, pausing at the top of the servants' staircase. The figure's footsteps echoed on the stone below, a steady, hurried patter. Porret descended 2 steps at a time, keeping his gaze fixed on the landing. The light from the windows above cast moving shadows, but the intruder was already halfway down the staircase when Colonel Montague's firm voice rang out, "Stop." The colonel thundered. The figure hesitated at the base of the stairs, then broke into a terrified run toward the scullery door. Porret pivoted, intercepting the corridor's fork. "Mademoiselle Blythe, with me. Lady Winthrop," ensured the other. "Exit is secured." The novelist nodded, and the two dashed in opposite directions. Miss Blythe sprinted toward the pantry, while Lady Winthrop, with Mrs. Smythe and Dr. Havisham in tow, moved toward the kitchen passage. The footman, no longer under the constraints of his livery, was nearly upon the pantry when Miss Blythe rounded the corner. "Monsieur," she cried, stepping into his path. He skidded to a halt, eyes frantic, and attempted to push past her. In that moment, Miss Blythe reached out and seized his arm. He tried to wrench free, tugging at her grip, but she held firm until Colonel Montague arrived. The colonel seized the footman's other arm, twisting them behind his back in a practiced motion that spoke of military training. "You shall go nowhere," he growled, behind them. Lady Winthrop's party emerged from the kitchen passage. Lady Winthrop placed a calming hand on Mrs. Smythe's trembling shoulder. "It is over," she murmured, voice steadier than she felt. Dr. Havisham knelt beside the footman, examining his distress. "He is injured," he said, pointing to a fresh gash on the footman's wrist. "Likely from shattered glass." Porritt arrived, pausing to survey the scene. The footman's face was ashen, sweat beaded on his brow. He shifted his weight, looking desperately from one face to the next. "Monsieur Porritt," he whispered hoarsely, "I could not bear the shame. The accusations. I thought. If I fled, I might start anew, sell the horseshoe in another town and repay our debts." Porritt nodded sympathetically. "Your fear was your prison. Yet in attempting escape, you confirmed what I suspected. The hidden passages you mapped for me and the pantry routes you used earlier were more than theoretical knowledge, they were your lifelines." He gestured toward the staircase leading to the wine cellar. "Take us there." They led the footmen back to the iron door in the undercroft. He produced the skeleton key, hands shaking violently, and unlocked it with a tremor that rattled the hinges. Inside, the lantern light caught the curved rows of barrels and flickered upon the locked chest bearing Lady Winthrop's initials. The footmen turned to it, eyes haunted. "I hid the horseshoe here," he confessed, unlocking the chest and revealing the velvet-lined box. Inside lay the gilded horseshoe, its golden leaf still gleaming beneath the lantern's glow. Porritt lifted it reverently and placed it carefully in a protective cloth. Lady Winthrop stepped forward, voice soft. "My precious Ellum." She unclasped the case and lifted the horseshoe, running her fingers over its smooth surface. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Half joy, half relief, Porritt's gaze returned to the footman. "And here," he said, pointing to a narrow shelf above the chest, "you stowed the vial once used in the attempt on Miss Foster's life." The footman nodded, voice trembling. "I meant only to dispose of it, but the cellar's humidity made me hesitate." Porritt produced the swatch of frayed velvet and held it near the lantern light. The crimson residue glimmered faintly. "You returned to this chamber not only to hide the horseshoe, but to wash the powder from the velvet. You believed the damp, stone and darkness would erase every trace." He folded the cloth round the horseshoe, separating it from the evidence. "Yet your haste left the crimson behind." Dr. Havisham stepped forward, examining the swatch, a curious compound. He observed softly, olfactory, inert until contact with metal. The footman bowed his head. "Monsieur, I did not foresee that detail." Porritt closed the chest and turned to face the group. The desperate attempt to escape, the use of hidden corridors, the stashing of evidence all spoke to a heart driven by fear and loyalty in equal measure. "You loved this hole and sought to save it. Yet in so doing you impelled every soul within its walls." He met the footman's gaze with compassion. "Now, you must face the consequences of your deeds not as a valet, but as a man." Lady Winthrop laid a gentle hand atop the footman's. "Your sacrifice," she said softly, "was meant to protect us. For that, we owe you gratitude despite the betrayal." Footman raised his eyes, brimming with remorse and relief. Colonel Montague unclasped his arms and stepped forward to clasp the footman's shoulder in solidarity. Miss Blythe, brushing hair from her face, regarded the scene with sober admiration. "You confounded us all," she murmured, "yet you also revealed the courage of conviction." Mrs. Smythe, tears in her eyes, produced smelling salts from her pocket and held them to the footman's nose. He inhaled deeply and steadied himself. Porritt raised his cane, signaling resolution. The escape failed, and now the final piece must fall into place. He turned to the vaulted ceiling of the cellar. From this chamber, secrets ascend to light. Tomorrow, we shall summon each witness, confirm every confession, and complete the tapestry of mystery. He lowered his voice to an intimate murmur. But tonight, let each of us reflect upon how fear drives men to desperate acts, and how mercy tempers the scales of justice. As they filed from the cellar, footmen escorted between Colonel Montague and Dr. Havisham, and the others trailing. Behind Porritt remained by the locked chest, hands folded across his waistcoat, the heavy door clanged shut, sealing within its darkness the echoes of a man's anguish and the final vestiges of a secret. Almost lost above, the first stars of evening shimmered against the sky, and within Marlford Hall, the master detective allowed himself a moment's quiet triumph, for, once more, his little grey cells had brought order to chaos, unveiling the truth even in the desperate flight of an anxious heart. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place late into the evening. After the adrenaline of pursuit and confession had subsided, Porritt retired once more to the library. The crackling fire cast dancing light upon the journals, sketches, and correspondence rayed across his desk. He moved with deliberate calm, ranging each piece to recreate the sequence of events: the vanished horseshoe, the vial that nearly killed Miss Foster, the poisoned canapes, the hidden letters, the torn sketches, and the desperate flight through hidden corridors. He paused at the small glass vial recovered from Miss Foster's trembling hand in Chapter 2. Its slender neck bore no label, and the cork was stained a faint shade of crimson. Porritt uncorked it, tipping a single drop onto a clean porcelain dish. It shimmered like liquid ruby. He dipped a match head into the residue and ignited it. The flame flickered pale blue before subsid. Cyanide, unquestionably the same deadly compound used in the dinner canapes. But here lay the subtle conundrum. The canapes had been poisoned by Dr. Havisham's supply, orchestrated by the footman. Yet this first vial had appeared before any knowledge of the horseshoe's disappearance. It had created the diversion that allowed the theft to pass unnoticed. Who had placed it in Miss Foster's purse? Porritt retrieved Mrs. Smythe's botanical compendium, leafing to the annotated pages on cyanide-bearing plants. Margins were scrawled with notes in her precise hand. Caution: skin contact insufficient. Activation requires metal. A tiny blot of ink smeared the edge of one page. Porritt compared it to the crimson stain on the vial's cork. They matched exactly. He turned to Miss Blyther's torn sketchbook page, restored now by careful replication. Along one margin, a faint fingerprint, partially smudged, betrayed someone unfamiliar with the pavilion's velvet paint. He dusted it with a fine brush, revealing the oily ridge of a fingertip. Beneath it lay a fragment of lavender fabric identical to the dress Miss Blythe wore at dinner, but too coarse for her gown. That fabric belonged to the nurse's uniform Mrs. Smythe had donned to administer smelling salts to Miss Foster. A sudden clarity illuminated Porritt's mind. He tapped the compendium. "Madam Smythe," he murmured, "you provided the knowledge of cyanide's activation and sterility. You knew that a drop in a vial placed in a purse would provoke alarm yet not immediately kill. You tested the effect. Your midnight pantry visits confirmed the distribution method. But you did. More, you planted that vial to sow initial panic, curious to see if your theory held. That fear alone would reveal hidden family tensions." Drawing on his library table, Porritt penned a brief note and summoned Mrs. Smythe. She entered, scholarly grace-tinged with anxiety, hands clasping her notebook as though shielding herself. "Madam," Porritt began softly, placing the vial and the compendium before her, "you told us your midnight excursions were to test for a poison in the pantry. Yet you did not stop at testing. You extracted cyanide from your herbarium and fashioned this vial, knowing it would activate only upon contact with metal, ensuring a dramatic physiological reaction. When Miss Foster handled a purse clasp, he paused, letting the weight of His revelation settled. Mrs. Smythe's breath hitched. "I only wished to protect her," she whispered. "I was certain there was danger in that household. Some deadly intention against my niece." Porritt inclined his head. "Your concern was genuine. But your methods crossed the line between science and intimidation. You became the puppet master of fear, using my poor cook's rosemary, the doctor's instruments, and even Miss Blyther's architectural sketches to validate your hypothesis." Tears welled in Mrs. Smythe's eyes. "I did not intend harm. I thought a controlled scare would flush out the true villain." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "But I see now I was the first to cast the die of terror." Porritt's expression softened with compassion. "Intentions can be noble, but actions bear consequences. Your initial vial gave cover for the horseshoes, theft, and set the stage for the footman's tragedy. Yet it also revealed the vulnerabilities we desired to expose, that every secret, no matter how carefully guarded, can be found." He closed the compendium and tucked the vial into an evidence bag. "Thus, the final piece falls into place. You, madam, ignited the spark of suspicion that illuminated the true actors, the footman's desperation, the doctor's zeal, the artist's unwitting assistance, the soldier's loyalty, and Lady Winthrop's poised anguish." He rose, extending a hand in comfort. "You are both scientist and storyteller, curious beyond bounds." Mrs. Smythe bowed her head. "I accept the consequences, Monsieur Porritt. May this be lesson enough to temper inquiry with caution." Porritt offered a gentle smile. "Indeed. And now, armed with complete knowledge, we may proceed to bring closure to this affair." He turned, glancing at the assembled shelves of books and the silent witnesses of secret passages. "Tomorrow, I shall present the full tapestry of revelations to our guests. Each of you shall hear how even the smallest actor torn page, a whispered note, a hidden vial wove together to create this grand drama." He extinguished the lamp, the library falling into contemplative darkness outside. The moonlight bathed Malford Hall in silver, as though cleansing its walls of the turmoil within. Porritt paused at the door, mustache twitching with satisfaction. His little Bracells, guided by the hidden connections and the secret clue, had at last assembled the puzzle's final fragment. And as he stepped into the corridor, he carried with him the certainty that dawn's gathering would unveil every truth, and with it deliver justice tempered by mercy to the hallowed halls of Malford. Chapter 15. The final gathering morning sun poured through the tall windows of Malford Hall's grand drawing-room, gilding the polished wood panels and illuminating the intricate lattice of shadows cast by the rose garlands overhead. The air was electric with anticipation, for today Porritt would convene the assembled cast of characters one final time before he disclosed the threads of his masterful tapestry. The drawing-room had been transformed into a stage, chairs ranged in a semicircle round the central parquet floor, a small table bearing the recovered horseshoe, the crimson-stained vial, the torn sketchbook, and the botanical compendium. Each object lay under a glass dome, gleaming like trophies of truth. One by one, the assembled guests entered. Lady Winthrop, her pale blue gown shimmering in the sunlight. Colonel Montague, erect in his military bearing yet with flickers of unease. In his eyes, Miss Blythe, clutching her restored sketchbook as though it were a talisman. Mrs. Smythe, notebook in hand, shoulders squared beneath her scholarly attire. And Dr. Haversham, gloves off at last, brow furrowed in contemplative gravity. They took their seats, silent and respectful, faces drawn but hopeful. Porritt appeared at the far end of the room, flanked by George in custody and Inspector Talbot, whose stern features softened at the sight of Porritt's serene confidence. Porritt raised a gloved hand in greeting. "Msamas, aujourd'hui, We gather to witness the culmination of our inquiry, not as judge and jury, but as seekers of truth. He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. He motioned to the table, before us lie the artifacts of a singular drama, the horseshoe stolen in plain view, the vial that threatened Miss Foster's life, the poisoned canapes meant to sow terror, the hidden letters that bound confidences, and the sketches that revealed all concealed passages. Each played its part under conditions of high society's common ear. He inclined his head toward the horseshoe. Let us begin where the mystery began. Poirot removed the glass dome. Lifting the gilded horseshoe into view, this object valued, not for gold or steel, but for lineage vanished in the early dawn. Its removal required inside knowledge, cunning dexterity, and a seamless diversion. You will recall the first diversion, a vial planted in Miss Foster's possession, a threat, without vision of the true danger. He turned, holding the vial aloft, the poison, colorless and odorless, until in contact with metal, stirred panic but not bloodshed. He paused, eyes sweeping over Miss Blythe and Mrs. Smythe. Our genealogist tested for a poison in the pantry, driven by familial concern. Our artist mapped corridors in service of her craft, oblivious that her sketches would guide the thief's footsteps. He placed the vial back under its dome and touched the torn sketchbook. These pages, once torn to hide your observations, revealed the secret roots beneath this house. Poirot shifted to the poisoned canapes. We dined under convivial pretenses, yet poison lay in wait. The canapes closest to the hostess was spared an act of selective terror meant to emphasize control over life and death. He looked to Dr. Havisham, whose fingers twitched. The source, your own medical stores, doctored under academic curiosity to test a hypothesis, yet weaponized by another's hand. Lady Winthrop's lips quivered as she listened, her gaze fixed on the compendium. Poirot lifted it gently, and here, the botanical compendium, its pages annotated with the properties of cyanide-yielding plants. From this tome, the poisons, nature was understood, its activation calculated, and its distribution engineered to terrify before any loss of life. He stepped back, folding his hands together. These elements constituted a symphony of deception, yet the final movement theft, terror, and blame required a conductor's skill in both shadow and subterfuge. He allowed a pause, watching the assembly lean forward, breath caught. Poirot continued, voice steady. George, the valet, acted in desperation born of loyalty and fear. He believed himself the sole author of this tragedy, erring in the conviction that sacrificial scandal could buy time to save the whole. But his actions were the culmination of another's design, not the genesis. At this, George's eyes fell. Poirot advanced slowly between the chairs, who then orchestrated the grand design, who predicted each of your responses: genealogist, doctor, artist, soldier, and Lady Anne shaped events so that each would play precisely to type. He paused before Colonel Montague. You, with your debt-driven confidences, you, with your strategic mind honed in service to crown and country. He moved on to Mrs. Smythe, you, whose midnight vigils tested the kitchens for poison, who penned notes on activation and concealment. To Miss Blythe, you, whose eye for detail unintentionally charted the hidden passages. To Dr. Havisham, you, whose instruments and compounds were commandeered from malevolent ends. And at last, to Lady Winthrop herself, you, under the stern serenity of a widow's guise, whose very composure became a shield against suspicion. Poirot lifted his cane, tapping it lightly on the floor. The mastermind stood among you all, directing from the center yet hidden in plain sight. He allowed his gaze to linger on each in turn. And now, as you absorb these recollections, Consider where your roles intersected the moment when the plan pivoted from theory to action. Lady Winthrop swallowed, glancing at the vial as though it might speak. Colonel Montag's fists clenched. Mrs. Smythe's breath hitched. Miss Blythe pressed upon her heart. Dr. Haversham's brow furrowed in sudden comprehension. Porritt raised a hand, calling for silence. In the intersection of fear and duty lies the final clue. It is in the moment when loyalty becomes betrayal, when compassion becomes coercion, and when art becomes blueprint. That pivot awaits unmasking. He turned toward Inspector Talbot. Inspector, will you see that every individual here is secure until we complete our revelations? The inspector inclined his head and signaled to constables, who stood ready at the door. Porritt turned back to the group. Samus, we shall reconvene in but a short while. During this pause, reflect upon your own impulses, your own choices, and the precise instant at which you crossed from observer to participant. He offered a slight bow, for when we return, the grand reveal will expose not only acts, but intentions. And with that understanding, justice and mercy may be served. With that, Porritt stepped back, allowing the tension to ebb into thoughtful silence. The suspects exchanged glances weighted with unspoken questions, each wondering who would be named at last. The drawing-room lay poised on the brink of revelation, a threshold beyond which no secret could endure. And amidst the hushed expectancy, Porritt's little grey cells awaited the moment to strike, weaving together every fragment into the final tapestry of truth. Chapter 16, the revealed drawing-room lay hushed, each occupant perched on the edge of their chair, eyes fixed on Porritt. The constables stood at the door, silent sentinels to the final act. Porritt moved to the center of the parquet floor, lifting his cane as though conducting an unseen orchestra. He paused, letting the silence swell, then spoke with deliberate clarity. Samus, we stand at the apex of our investigation. Here, we shall untangle every thread of deception, revealing not only who acted, but why and how each act served the grand design. He gestured first toward Mrs. Smythe. Let us begin at the genesis of this affair. The vial planted in Miss Foster's purse. Madam, you acknowledged that your midnight forays into the pantry were tests of suspicion, yet you did not stop at suspicion. You extracted cyanide from your botanical compendium, crafted this vial, and placed it deliberately in my friend's belongings. Your aim was to provoke alarm, to observe the household's response, and to unmask latent malice. Mrs. Smythe bowed her head. I confess, Monsieur Porritt, my intentions were protective though tragically misdirected. I sought only to flush out a genuine threat. Porritt inclined his head. Understood. Your academic mind saw a hypothesis, and in so seeing, you became the first spark of chaos. He turned to Dr. Haversham. Next, the poison in the evening canapes. Doctor, you provided the means, a measured quantity of cyanide drawn from your professional stores under the guise of a clinical test. Yet you did so unaware of its ultimate purpose. The doctor's shoulder slumped. I believed I served science, not crime. I trusted that my colleagues' notes were for academic curiosity. Porritt's mustache twitched. Your science was the instrument, Doctor, yet you were an unwitting accomplice to a darker ambition. Porritt paced slowly toward Miss Blythe. Mademoiselle, your sketches of the service corridors illuminated every hidden passage knowledge. Invaluable to a clandestine act, you entrusted those sketches to the cook, believing them safe, oblivious that they served as the blueprint for the theft. Miss Blythe met his gaze, eyes glistening. I sought only artistry, monsieur. I never dreamed my drawings would guide a man's desperation. Porritt nodded, innocent by intent, yet complicit by effect. He paused, letting each realization sink in, before directing his attention to Colonel Montague and Lady Winthrop. You to share secrets of debt and lineage. motives that might drive one to extremes. Yet neither of you moved the horseshoe nor administered poison. Your roles were those of unwitting decoys bait to lure suspicion from the true architect. All eyes shifted to George, the valet, standing with downcast gaze at Poynton's portrait. Inspector Talbot signalled, and the constable stepped forward, bringing George into the circle. Porritt held his cane aloft. And now, the central figure, the one whose loyalty to Mulford Hall became his undoing. He turned to George, voice gentle yet firm. You removed the horseshoe at dawn, seized the nail, and slipped the vial into Miss Foster's purse. You staged the dinner poisoning to distract and terrify, believing that if this household trembled, its overseers would reveal their true colors. You believed you acted to save your charge. George lifted his head, eyes brimming with remorse. It was to give us breathing room. Monsieur, the debts loomed large. The collectors would seize the whole at sunset. Porritt raised a finger to forestall further. Apology. Yes, George. Your devotion blinded you to the cost of deceit. You believed you could wrest time from fate by sowing chaos. Yet in so doing, you imperiled those you cherished. He swept his gaze over the assembled party. Thus the scheme unfolds: the genealogist's initial vial, the doctor's academic supply, the artist's revealing sketches, all conduits unwittingly provided for George's desperate design. He acquired the horseshoe to sell. He engineered fear to cloak his act, and he scattered evidence to implicate others. His final act, the attempt to flee, was the confession that allowed us to reconstruct the entire sequence as silence as. Profound as night descended, Porritt folded his hands and offered a measured smile. Now, justice must take its course. George will answer for the theft and the poisonings. Madam Smythe will face censure for a scientific misadventure. Dr. Havisham will account for his unwitting complicity. Mademoiselle Blythe must learn that artistry bears responsibility. Colonel Montague and Lady Winthrop must reconcile that secrets of the heart can spark unintended consequences. He stepped toward Lady Winthrop. Madam, you endured this ordeal with grace. May Mulford Hall's legacy endure, tempered by honesty rather than concealment. He inclined his head to Colonel Montague. And you, Colonel, whose honor guides many, may this serve as a reminder that silent debts can weigh heavier than steel. Porritt turned back to the group, voice warm with compassion. Msamus, we have witnessed how fear, loyalty, curiosity, and desperation intertwine. We have seen how a single crimson stain upon velvet can set a mighty house trembling. Today, that tremor gives way to clarity. We may now restore the whole's peace. For the true culprit stands identified and the misdirections laid bare. He gestured toward Inspector Talbot. Inspector, see that the horseshoe is returned to its rightful place and that the vials and implements are sealed for safekeeping. Let the legal process proceed accordingly. The inspector nodded, signaling his men together. The evidence, Porritt raised his cane one final time. Let justice be tempered with mercy, for every heart here bore the burden of fear. And may the lessons of this affair guide us to speak truth boldly, to question gently, and to trust wisely. As the constables led George from the room, the assembled guests exchanged solemn nods, gratitude for the resolution, sorrow for the fallen, and hope for a future unshadowed by suspicion. Porritt lingered, gazing at the recovered horseshoe under its glass dome, his mustache twitching with quiet satisfaction. His little grey cells had triumphed once more, restoring order to Mulford Hall and sealing this chapter of psychological intrigue with the precision only he could command. Chapter 17, Outcome and Justic. The late morning sun filtered through the tall drawing-room windows as Inspector Talbot reconvened the assembled guests to witness the return of the prized horseshoe to its rightful place, the horseshoe. Gleaming anew with Lady Winthrop's careful polishing, lay upon its velvet, cushioned beneath a protective glass case. Round it stood Poirot, Lady Winthrop, Colonel Montague, Miss Blythe, Mrs. Smythe, and Dr. Havisham, each bearing the subtle marks of a trial by fear and revelation. Inspector Talbot cleared his throat. With the culprit apprehended and the artifacts of offence secured, he began formally, "We are prepared to restore Mulford Hall's legacy to its former dignity." He nodded to Colonel Montague, who gently fitted the horseshoe back onto its cushion. The velvet cushion bore the faintest fray, now expertly mended. As though to erase the final vestiges of the crime, Lady Winthrop stepped forward to stand beside. "Poirot, monsieur," she said, voice steady though her eyes glistened, "I thank you for your extraordinary dedication to the truth and to the preservation of our home." Poirot inclined his head. "Madam, it is through your candour despite fear and your faith in justice that order prevails." Inspector Talbot glanced at George, who now stood outside the drawing-room under respectful escort. His shoulders slumped, yet his gaze proud in its regret. "The valet will be conveyed to the local magistrate," Talbot continued. "His attempt at theft and the subsequent poisonings are serious offences. However, the circumstances of his desperation will be duly considered in sentencing." He paused, ensuring each guest absorbed the weight of mercy tempered by the law. Miss Blythe, stepping lightly forward, addressed the inspector. "Will George face the full rigour of the law?" she asked softly. Talbot offered a reassuring nod. "His motive preservation of the whole will be weighed. I anticipate leniency. Perhaps community service in lieu of imprisonment." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the assembled, as compassion found its measure in justice. Mrs. Smythe advanced, placing her botanical compendium beside the restored sketchbook. "And my own actions, Inspector?" she inquired with trembling dignity. "My misguided experiment wrought terror, yet no lives were lost." Talbot turned to her with a kindly expression. "Your confession and cooperation have been exemplary. While you may face censure from the Geneva Society of Botanists for negligence, your intentions were protective. No criminal charges will be pressed." Mrs. Smythe exhaled, relief and remorse mingling in her gaze. Dr. Havisham stepped forward, removing the last of his gloves. "And I, Inspector," he asked, "I provided the poison unwittingly, yet allowed it to be used." Talbot regarded him thoughtfully. "You will face a formal inquiry by the medical board for breach of ethical standards. Criminal charges are unlikely, given your immediate cooperation and lack of malice." The doctor bowed his head in gratitude. The burden of guilt now eased by understanding and due process. Colonel Montague, dusting a speck of dust from his uniform, addressed the assembly. "I must apologize to George," he said, voice resonant with sincerity. "My secret debts drew him into folly. I shall embrace responsibility and settle those debts in full." Lady Winthrop laid a gentle hand upon the colonel's arm. "Your honour remains intact, Archibald, and so shall ours." Miss Blythe turned to Lady Winthrop with quiet determination. "I, too, owe a debt to truth and to your home. I shall dedicate the profits from my next novel to the Hall's maintenance, and ensure my sketches serve art. Never misdirection." Lady Winthrop smiled warmly. "Your gift will honour the Hall's future. Eloise." Poirot surveyed the gathering at a blow-off. "Reconciliation and renewed bonds. Msamus," he said softly. "You have each borne trials of fear and conscience. You face doubts, suspicion, and the shattering of trust. Yet through confession and mercy, you have reclaimed both your dignity and your unity." He turned to Lady Winthrop. "Madam, the Hall stands restored not only by stone and timber, but by the integrity of its guardians." She inclined her head. "Thanks to you, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot offered a modest bow. "I merely guided the way. The true strength lies in your capacity for honesty and compassion." Inspector Talbot cleared his throat once more. Let us then adjourn to the garden, where a modest luncheon awaits. There we shall toast to Mulford Hall's entrance." As the guests began to file out, Lady Winthrop pausing to linger for a final glance at the horseshoe Poirot remained by the display, hands folded. In that moment, the horseshoe seemed to shimmer not with gold, but with the lessons it had wrought, that the bonds of loyalty can become chains when fear dictates, and that the restoration of peace demands both truth and mercy. As the doors swung open and laughter, cautious, hopeful laughter, drifted in from the sunlit terrace, Poirot allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. His little grey cells, having navigated the labyrinth of deception and desperation, now rested briefly, content in the knowledge that justice tempered by compassion had been deftly served at Mulford Hall. Chapter 18. The closing remark. Soft laughter and the clinking of porcelain drifted through the garden terrace as the lingering guests of Mulford Hall enjoyed a modest luncheon beneath the perfumed rose arbors. Sunlight warmed the restored lawn. The air was filled with the sweet promise of renewal. At a quiet corner table, Poirot sat beside Lady Winthrop, Colonel Montague, Miss Blythe, Mrs. Smythe, and Dr. Havisham, each bearing the gentle relief that follows a storm of suspicion and revelation. Lady Winthrop lifted her cup of elderflower tea and smiled at Poirot. "Monsieur, you have done more than recover a stolen heirloom or expose a chemist's curiosity turned perils. You have reminded us all of the fragile balance between duty and compassion." Poirot inclined his head, mustache quivering with modest delight. "Madam, it is the essence of my little grey cells to restore equilibrium. Yet it is your own courage to confront truth that renders the whole strong once more." Across the table, Miss Blythe set aside her sketchbook. "I have learned that every stroke of the pen carries consequence," she said softly. "I shall sketch not only for beauty, but for the highest good." Colonel Montague, his uniform pressed and immaculate, reached across to squeeze her hand. "And I shall ensure those corridors serve only the passage of honesty, not secrets." Mrs. Smythe dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "My pursuit of knowledge must be tempered by wisdom and restraint," she murmured. "No more midnight experiments." Dr. Havisham nodded solemnly. "And I shall practice medicine with renewed devotion to life rather than mere curiosity." Poirot watched them with keen satisfaction. Then, rising gracefully, he tapped his fork against his tea saucer. "Samus," he began, voice carrying across the terrace, "before we part, allow me one final reflection." He paused as the table fell silent, the staff pausing their service to listen. "A mystery like this affair at Mulford Hall is born of human failings, fear, desperation, curiosity, and resolved by human virtues, honesty, courage, and compassion. Each clue we gathered was a thread in the tapestry of human nature. The stolen horseshoe revealed discerned loyalty turned desperate. The poisoned vial and canapes displayed both academic zeal and the fine line between protection and peril. The torn sketches and hidden letters exposed how trust can be both shield and weapon. You, my dear friends, have faced these truths with grace." He lifted his cup, inviting the others to do the same. "Let us toast to Mulford Hall, not merely a house of stone and ivy, but a refuge of hearts resilient enough to embrace truth." To Lady Winthrop's steadfast resolve, Colonel Montague's honour, Miss Blythe's artistry, Mrs. Smythe's learning, Dr. Havisham's healing spirit, and even to George, whose redemption reminds us that mercy can rebuild what fear would destroy. The small party raised their glasses. To Mulford Hall, they cried, voices mingling in harmony. The sun slipped behind a drifting cloud, casting a golden glow over the rose-laden arbor. As if blessing their vow, Poirot lingered a moment longer, gazing at the vaulted facade of the hall beyond. its windows gleaming like watchful eyes. He murmured to himself, "Every crime, no matter how cunning, leaves a whisper of its maker's soul, and every heart that seeks atonement must follow that whisper to its rightful place." He turned then, offering his companions a final nod of warm approval, and strolled back toward the open terrace door. As he passed beneath the arching blooms, he allowed himself a satisfied sigh. The case of the affair at Malford Hall was closed, its mysteries resolved with logic and compassion, its lessons learned, and its legacy preserved, and in the quiet hush that followed, the roses seemed to lean closer, their petals whispering secrets of renewal and hope. As Malford Hall stood proud once more under the watchful eye of its champion, Hercule Poirot,